forward to my trip home. Yeah, I guess I'll start with a ʻōlelo introduction, and then I'll jump right in. But I'll try to end around the 45 mark, so there'll be a lot of time for Q&A. But yeah, o Maile Renee Arvin Ko'ui Noa, no Kene Kuke mai au, no hoʻau ma Utah, ma Salt Lake City, ma Ka'aina o nā poʻe o na Ute, Shoshone, Goshute, and Paiute, ame na poʻe Dene. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Let's see, let me share my screen and okay. Is that showing up okay for you all? Okay. So yeah, I'll talk about the title of my talk and kind of my project in a minute. But I wanted to start, let's see, oh, I have too many screens open. Sorry, are there slides advancing for you, or what do you all see?
We see your PowerPoint.
Yeah, is it like advancing? I can't tell.
We're looking at it from an editor's point of view.
Okay, hold on, let me try to do it better.
Yes, full presentation screen.
Sorry, the issue is I'm trying to also read my talk off of my computer. And I used to know how to do this during the pandemic, but it's been a little while. Oh, maybe this one. There. Okay.
Yes, we see your presentation.
Okay, sorry, mahalo. Okay, so yes, like I said, I will talk more about the title in a minute, but to jump right in, I wanted to start with this letter. So in August of 1866, Mr. Hyde, the superintendent of the new Keone'ula Reformatory and Industrial School in Honolulu, wrote to the Hawaiian Kingdom's Board of Education with a plea to stop sending him girls. He wrote, "A female child having been committed to the reformatory school, I beg to submit to you the difficulties of receiving her under present circumstances, and if you wish females to be received, the necessity of making some preliminary arrangements for the complete separation of the sexes. I feel convinced that any attempt to carry both, meaning boys and girls, on the same site must result in a miserable failure. If you will recollect, the advertisement I answered was headed Reformatory School for Boys, and on my appointment, you gave me verbal assurance it was a school for boys only. Had it been otherwise, I should have withdrawn my application. I have been straightforward and candid throughout and have always opposed the admission of girls." So Mr. Hyde never directly addresses in his letters what he finds so impossible about receiving girls into his care, though his insistence on the need for separation of the sexes suggests a primary concern is improper sexual relationships or sexual abuse between the students. Likely another major concern was a gendered understanding of labor, in which the agricultural work that Mr. Hyde oversaw was seen as inappropriate for girls. Mr. Hyde and other Haole residents of Hawaii understood domestic training as more suited to girls, including working as maids in laundries or maintaining their own household after they were married. Much of Mr. Hyde's correspondence with the Board of Education throughout his tenure as superintendent concerned this problem, so-called problem, with girls. While there are various attempts at establishing a separate school for girls during the Kingdom period, the Board of Education does not appear to have ever fully stopped sending girls to the reformatory, though they were always represented in comparatively small numbers to the boys. While Mr. Hyde complains that the reformatory was meant to be only for boys, in fact, the law establishing the reformatory makes no such gendered distinctions. The 1864 Legislative Act authorizing the school is titled, I'm sorry, I think I messed up my slide order, but here's the title, an act authorizing the Board of Education to establish an industrial and reformatory school for the care and education of helpless and neglected children, as also for the reformation of juvenile offenders. And for the ʻōlelo speakers, you can see that in ʻōlelo, the school is being called kula ʻa'o hanalima me ka hoʻopololei. The text of the act refers only to children and youth, or keiki and opiopio in the ʻōlelo, not only boys and girls. In my talk today, I examine the history of the Keone-ʻula Industrial and Reformatory School, which officially opened in 1865, as well as some of the successor institutions, including the Waileʻe Training School for Boys and the Kapuāiwa Training School for Girls. I will also offer some more informal comments and reflections on the ongoing research and community engagement I'm working on in collaboration with many others, including perhaps some folks who are in the room with you all today. I can't really make you all out, but yeah. Yeah, I wanted to share before I got more specific about the title that I've been using for my project lately, which is Naile Poina ʻOle, which comes from this ʻōlelo noʻeau that many of you probably are familiar with. Hele Poina ʻOle Kekeiki, a child is a lei never forgotten, which evokes many kind of sweet images of, babies being cradled in parents' arms, or I don't know, like now I have a 4-year-old and it's still very sweet, but she's very big and she's like hangs off my neck, which again is kind of evoking. So for me, this ʻōlelo noʻeau evokes kind of the many stages of parenthood, or just childcare, and just to me it signifies, it's one of many ʻōlelo noʻeau about keiki and how precious keiki are. And for me, it really just, on the one hand, reminds me that Hawaiians always have cared for and valued children very, very greatly. And then, in another way, it signifies kind of what I hope the research that I'm doing can do kind of symbolically for the children that were at these schools who may have been forgotten in kind of the larger historical record. But what I'm hoping my research can do is kind of, even if they have been long deceased, kind of, just making them beloved again, or kind of finding ways to care for or malama them today, even if that wasn't their experience in their own lifetime. And then I thought I would actually front my acknowledgements instead of leaving them until the end, although maybe I'll put it back up at the end. But I just want to give you a sense of, I know a lot of people speak about how research and writing is never kind of an individual project or act, but I think much more than anything I've done before, I've had so much help with this project, and so many people are continuing to collaborate with me in ways that really benefit me personally, but I think hopefully the things that we're working on collaboratively can be of service to our larger communities and Lahui. So, but yeah, just thanks so much to Heijin and Lani for hosting me as a visiting scholar over the summer, which really helped me be in Hawaii for a longer period of time over the summer to do some of the research for this project. And obviously, thank you for hosting me today to share some of this research. This feels cheesy, but I do feel like I have to thank my mom, both for like watching my kids sometimes while I'm doing this research. And, this research has a family connection, which my tutu, my mom's mom, worked at the Kapuāiwa school, kind of at a later period than what my research is looking at so far, but at the time when it was called koʻolau. But so one of the ways I came to this research is through my mom's kind of stories of visiting the school that her mom worked at as a child. And then I have two really amazing undergraduate researchers who are able to come with me to Hawaii for a week. And they're continuing to work with me this semester. And they are Callie Avendet and Eliana Massey. Eliana's Kanaka also, but she grew up in Texas and she had never been to Hawaii until this summer. And it's been amazing to have her working on the project. And then some community folks who kind of steward the land that the Waile'e school used to be on are Jamie Mahealani Miller, who's part of the ʻōle Napua organization that runs Pearl Haven, which is a home for sex trafficked girls or kind of at-risk girls that now sits on the Mauka side of what used to be the Waile'e school. And as well as Kavela Ferrant, who's part of the North Shore Community Land Trust, or I don't know, he kind of seems like he is North Shore Community Land Trust, and he does such amazing work in leading restoration of the land on the Makai side of the land that used to be the Waile'e school. This picture is from that side of the land at Waile'e when Kavela hosted my students and I and my mom over the summer. And then this got out of order, I think, in my thinking, but I've been really blessed to be able to take ʻōlelo classes at UH, or I was during the pandemic because all the classes were online. And so I've had a lot of amazing ʻōlelo teachers, but I mean, special thanks are appropriate, especially to Kumu Lalepa Koga and Kumu Kaliko Aloha Martin, who continued to meet with me and help me translate a lot of the ʻōlelo sources for this research, which I just really couldn't do without their great help and support. Oh gosh, this isn't getting too long, but anyway, maybe I'll stop with those acknowledgements, and then if I have time, I'll come back to them at the end, especially as I say a little bit more about kind of the ongoing work. Okay. And this is just kind of an overview, kind of a map to show folks who might not be familiar with where the institutions that I'm looking at in this research are. Waile'e is on the North Shore. It's kind of between Ted's and Turtle Bay. And then Keoneʻula, the school I'll probably talk most about today, is located, for a while it shared the site with Ka'iulani Elementary in Kapamama across from Kaumakapili Church. And then also for a short time, there was a girls' school actually it's probably now part of your campus, but it was in Mōʻī, kind of very lower campus, I think around where maybe some baseball fields are now. But yeah, I'll talk some more, but I'll leave this slide up for a little bit to, if it helps orient things. So as this audience is well aware, in 1865, when that first reformatory opened, Hawaii was still an independent nation under the reign of King Kamehameha V, La Kapuāiwa. Nonetheless, Hawaii was under increasing pressure from foreign powers to open up Hawaiian lands and waters to the development of sugar plantations. The Mōʻī explained his rationale for the school as a matter of great importance, noting the management of which the health and morality of the rising generation should receive as much consideration as the effort to impart knowledge. A reformatory industrial school for young persons who are not subject to or who disregard parental authority is very much needed. Indeed, their concern about the lack of proper parental authority is one that comes up again and again in the historical record about the reformatory. At this period, discourses about how maka'ainana, or regular Native Hawaiian citizens, are unfit, backwards parents start to become more and more prevalent. In this talk, I'll argue that the criminalization, institutionalization, and indenture of Hawaiian youth in this era represented a stark shift in Hawaiian understandings of childhood, parenting, education, and labor, all of which were beginning to be gendered in ways that were new and different to Hawaiian people. These key changes were a key part of settler colonial ideologies introduced by white advisors to Kamehameha V, even while Hawaii remained formally sovereign. The new institution of harshly punitive laws for minor transgressions of youth laid a strong foundation for the continuation of Native Hawaiian youth incarceration and the disruption of Native Hawaiian forms of kinship after Hawaii became a U.S. territory in 1900. It would only be after Hawaii became a territory that a separate industrial school for girls would open. In 1903, the territorial government moved the reformatory to Waiale'e on the North Shore, ostensibly in order to be farther removed from the urban vices of Honolulu and closer to sugar plantations where the children could work. And at this time, it was only in 1903 that they specified that the reformatory, the school, was solely for boys. And in 1904, an industrial school only for girls opened at the former ʻOle site. So despite the actions of the Hawaiian Kingdom, many Native Hawaiians, including parents, representatives in the kingdom legislature, and others writing in the Hawaiian language newspapers of the time, vigorously challenged the practices of sending children to the reformatory and indenturing them out as apprentice labor to plantations, other trades, or as domestic labor in private households. Most documentation of these challenges are written in ʻōlelo Hawaii and have been entirely overlooked by historians of Hawaii who do not consult Hawaiian language sources. In this paper, I will briefly situate the history of the reformatory and its construction of gendered forms of labor within the larger literatures on Hawaiian family, labor, and legal histories, and the practices of compulsory education and indentured apprenticeships in the US, from which the Hawaiian Kingdom modeled their own practice. I'll then, if I still have time, analyze a few different examples of Hawaiians attempting to challenge, close, or reform the reformatory as evidence of how Hawaiian Kingdom citizens did not passively accept the adoption of Western practices of child institutionalization and indenture. So traditionally, Native Hawaiian approaches to parenting and childhood differed from Western ones in many ways. Grandparents instead of parents, as Mary Kavena Puku'i tells us in the Polynesian family system of Ka'u, but also just as is familiar to many of us, were often primarily responsible for raising children and educated them informally and formally. If a child demonstrated an aptitude for a certain art or craft that their grandparent was not experienced in, they could be sent to live with an expert in that art who was also usually a relative. This and other types of open adoption were also practiced, so it was not necessarily expected that the biological parents would be the only or primary caregivers of children. In general, Hawaiian children were expected to learn through observation and practice, not through direct instruction or asking questions. Thus, living with other relatives besides the parents to learn an art or skill was common. Hawaiian society was shaped around gender in the sense that men and women often seemed to have distinct spheres of power. Nonetheless, these spheres were not as strictly bounded as Western gender binaries, and there was an idea that the power of each gender should be kept in balance. After infancy, boys were more often cared for by a male relative and girls by female relatives. But again, there wasn't necessarily a strict binary, and those weren't also those, it bears repeating that those weren't the only genders as well. So thus the idea of separating boys and girls for certain kinds of care and training was not new or objectionable to Native Hawaiians. However, ideas about the danger or impropriety of boys and girls mixing certainly were new. Indeed, many categories of crime, as well as the very practice of incarceration for having committed a crime, was new. Prior to Western contact, serious offenses often simply resulted in death by order of the ʻaliʻi. When the reformatory opened in 1865, the list of offenses that could get a child institutionalized there included theft, vagrancy, disobedience, and truancy. It appears that initially the few girls who were sent to the reformatory were generally sent for theft. For example, in this newspaper article from 1873, if I can find it. Oh, okay, maybe I don't have it. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Two little Native girls stole small articles from an auction room, and one was subsequently sentenced to the reformatory. Like Superintendent Hyde, the author of this article notes, this reminds us that the next legislature should be urged to provide for the correctional care of young female offenders. The school at Palama is for boys only. Again, it was only in 1904 that such a school actually opened for girls. By that time, while theft was still a possible offense, almost all the girls who were sent to the girls' industrial school were committed there because of crimes in some way related to perceived sexual offenses, which could be anything from being seen, so-called associating with boys at a party, to being pregnant out of wedlock. The offenses boys were convicted of continued to be largely theft, vagrancy, disobedience, and truancy. So there's a lot more to say about the distinct gendering of crimes after Hawaii became a territory than I have room for today, but I want to spend a bit more time discussing the history of how truancy became a crime. Looking at the history of truancy in Hawaii illustrates the complicated nature of analyzing how the Hawaiian kingdom was implicated in instituting changes that would become seriously damaging to Native Hawaiian youth and families. While it's inaccurate to say that the kingdom government was wholeheartedly and knowingly implementing settler colonial policies, though its actions did establish a foundation that white settlers would dramatically expand after Hawaii's annexation, it does seem fair to say that the kingdom was heavily supporting the implementation of the capitalist society at this time. For the new capitalist economy centered around the sugar industry, the kingdom needed labor. And while, as I'm sure everyone in that room knows, they largely turned to various sources of immigrant labor from Asia and elsewhere, they also did want their own Maka'ainana youth to work on sugar plantations as well. So how did truancy become a crime in the Hawaiian kingdom, and how did it relate to new capitalist forms of labor? To explain this, you need to know, but probably most of you do know, I love talking to Hawaii audiences because then I realize how much I have to put in to explain to like Utah audiences. But anyway, to explain this, you should know that memorization of knowledge and genealogy was and still is very important to Native Hawaiians, as prior to the arrival of American and Tahitian missionaries in 1820, Hawaiian was solely an oral, not written language. Missionaries created an alphabet for Hawaiian language in order to better proselytize through disseminating the Bible in Hawaiian. And as Hawaiian scholar David Chang has argued, kapalapala, or the written word, would quickly come into high demand. By the late 1820s, Chang writes, 1/3 of the populace was reported to be learning kapalapala, and as soon as one had learned, they would informally teach others. Simultaneously, mission schools were founded as early as 1821, and through the 1930s, other local public schools opened in various parts of the kingdom. These schools were formally codified into one public education system in 1840. By 1843, the Hawaiian Kingdom would pass literacy and compulsory education laws. Citizens were required to know how to read and write before they could be married. Children from the ages of 4 to 14 years old had to attend school. If they did not attend school, the parents of children under 8 would be forced to do public labor on a certain number of labor days every month and prohibited from cutting timber or fishing in areas owned by the king. If children over the age of 8 did not attend school, those children themselves would have to perform public labor. Such laws appear to be a mix of pre-contact kapu laws, such as the prohibitions on fishing, and laws from Massachusetts that were actually based in Puritan laws about compulsory education that were first passed all the way back in 1642. So many scholars, probably some of you all that are in the room right now, have persuasively argued that the Hawaiian Kingdom at this time was strategically adopting and adapting aspects of Western law, both to better regulate foreign residents and to maintain the nation's independence. The literacy and compulsory education laws were passed under the reign of ʻOle, who famously stated, maybe I can go find that slide that I had on of him. Oh, yeah. He aupuni pala ko'u, mine is the kingdom of literacy. Native Hawaiians today are justifiably proud of this history. Within 20 or so years of the Hawaiian language becoming a written language, the literacy rate is estimated to have been over 90% of the Hawaiian population. Less scholarly attention has been given, however, to the more punitive aspects of ʻOle's compulsory education laws. It appears that the consequence for not attending school for children over the age of 8, participation in public labor days for several days a month, may have been the first instance of children being forced to work as a punishment under the Hawaiian Kingdom, under Hawaiian Kingdom law. 7 years after this law was put in place, a broader system of indentured apprenticeships of children was further established through the Hawaiian Kingdom's Masters and Servants Act of 1850. Based on similar laws from New York State and Massachusetts, this act regulated 2 types of labor: indentured apprenticeships for children aged 10 to 20, and contract labor for those over the age of 20. This form of indentured apprenticeship was sometimes referred to as pauper apprenticeship, as scholars Ruth Wallace Herndon and John E. Murray define as a system used widely in early America to redirect the lives of poor children who were illegitimate, orphaned, abandoned, or otherwise considered by authorities to be at risk. Bound out to masters, these children were raised to adulthood in a legal condition of servitude. Many scholars have noted the importance of the Masters and Servants Act in Hawaii in the regulation of adult contract labor from abroad, including the first wave of 280 Chinese migrants who came to work on sugar plantations in 1852. However, none have specifically addressed the history of indentured apprenticeships. Perhaps this comparative lack of scholarship is because of sparse documentation, given that the Native Hawaiian children thus indentured would not have immigration records like the contract laborers from China. However, as I've discovered through research at the Hawaii State Archives, one place where records of indentured apprenticeships do appear is in relation to the children who were indentured out from the ʻOle Industrial and Reformatory School. The Board of Education managed the reformatory and had been specifically authorized to indenture kolohe children who were punished for crimes in 1858. Kolohe, again, as this room knows, is a Hawaiian word, commonly meaning mischievous or naughty. It's really interesting when you look at the law as it was translated into English at this time, and they translated kolohe into vicious, likely meaning not just like mean, like we might think of it as today, but more more literally like being prone to vice and immorality. Compared to the Hawaiian kolohe, vicious connoted a much more serious Christian-inflected sense of sin. When the reformatory opened in 1865, its proponents justified it by portraying it as a progressive measure to keep from sending children convicted of crimes to jail, which was another recent institution, as the first jail on Oahu had opened in 1857. The idea was if children were sent to jail, they would be influenced by adult criminals and become more immoral. So while many likely sincerely believed in these noble ideas, the reformatory quickly became a key source of indentured child labor. As it was in the United States, concern over kolohe children was spurred by urbanization and industrialization. Honolulu at this time was a rapidly growing port city, a harbor town that did a brisk trade in goods from ports in California. And with the growth of Honolulu as a city, as in cities in the US, there was also a rise in public concerns about so-called delinquent children. Delinquency at this time was a rather loose designation that could encompass children who had run away from home or who were unsheltered, orphaned, or otherwise abandoned by their birth families. In New York, organizations like the Children's Aid Society believed that such youth could be reformed, often by moving youth from cities to rural farms, where they would be so-called rehabilitated through agricultural training. More broadly, the reformatories were seen as a necessary intervention into the lives of youth who were not being properly raised by their family in accordance with dominant white social norms and expectations about labor. In New York, the improper families being referred to in such discourse were usually recent European immigrants. But in Hawaii at this time, it was poor Native Hawaiian families who were seen as failing to raise industrious, moral children. It was largely Native Hawaiian boys, not girls, who appear in English language newspaper articles in the Kingdom era as failing to be industrious and moral. I don't know why exactly girls were not often arrested for truancy, but it appears boys taking up public space was simply more policed. And let's see, In 1879, an article in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser decries what it calls wharf and harbor rats. We refer to the two-legged sort, native boys who apparently have nobody to care for them and are seen mornings coming out from beneath lumber piles or the steamer wharf where they have slept. The reformatory school would be a better lodging for them. So the stark racism of referring to Native Hawaiian boys as wharf rats demonstrates the sense that many white Honolulu residents had that Native Hawaiian boys were taking up too much space in Honolulu and needed to be removed. By indenturing poor Native Hawaiian boys out to sugar plantations and poor Native Hawaiian girls out to rich households as maids, the Hawaiian Kingdom, including both the ali'i and their white advisors, were attempting to align with white American and Christian expectations about what a modern productive society looked like. Yet this alignment was far from easy or guaranteed. Based on the large number of letters from anguished parents pleading for their children back that are archived in the records of the reformatory, many did not agree with the practice of institutionalizing children, potentially for years at a time for minor transgressions. Many letters mention distress at the length of sentences for skipping school, which, I can say more about that. But in general, children would get sentences of a year or more, and many children were sentenced for until they reached the age of majority, which varied over the years, but could be until 21. So too, it seems possible that the practice of indentured apprenticeships, which could also last for years at a time, may not have been well understood by families. The indentures could well have been mistaken for a more traditional form of Hawaiian apprenticeship, whereby a child would live with and learn from an expert in an art or trade they were interested in, or other kinds of open forms of open adoption. When families discovered that their child's sentence in the reformatory was long-term and without break, many seemed distraught. One such letter sent on October 20th, 1866 to the Board of Education directly requests the release of the child Kahilahila, written by a third party, perhaps because the parents, Ka'aua and Leholani of Honolulu, could not write themselves, which, again, given what I had just said about the widespread literacy of Hawaiians at this time, may have been a sign of their poverty. The letter states, "Very great is our love for our child." Promising to properly care for and educate their child, these parents end the letter with a plea to the board to please end this great burden of sorrow. Such letters, which express great humility and frequent assurances that they will better fulfill their roles as parents, counter assumptions that Native Hawaiians were uncaring parents or that so-called child delinquency was caused by the lack of good parenting. These parents thus clearly understood their child being held at the reformatory as a great hardship. The presence of such letters show that Native Hawaiians did not simply accept the new practice of institutionalizing kolohe or misbehaving children without protest. Critiques also appeared in the newspapers. In 1871, a short article was printed in the Ku'oko'a, noting that 10 boys from the reformatory had been sent to work on a sugar plantation in Kaneohe. The article criticized this example of indentured child labor, asking, "Is this the reformatory which the courts intended when they committed boys to Keoni'ula?" This article is partially reprinted in the Pacific Commercial Advertiser a week later under the heading "Cheap Labor" with added commentary. While agreeing that such labor would not fit that so-called educational aspirations of the reformatory, the article nonetheless expresses confidence that the intent of the plantation owner who indentured the 10 boys was good, doubtless acting from a charitable desire to relieve the school of the care and bother of a few surplus boys, natives, you know, who thus taken while young would be manageable. So we see here that the author of this English language article, even if generally agreeing that indenturing children to sugar plantations would not benefit them, nonetheless believed more fundamentally that Native Hawaiian so-called surplus boys were destined to grow up to be unmanageable. Even staff of the reformatory were often quite critical of it. In 1873, the Hawaiian language newspaper Ko Hawaiʻi Ponoʻī published an account of the school by S.K. Mahoi, a Native Hawaiian assistant teacher working at the reformatory. Mahoi argued that the school should be a pu'uhonua, meaning a place of refuge or sanctuary, which provided proper care for mistreated children and kept them from going to jail. Yet, that in the years before he worked there, he wrote, it was a place much feared. Here's my transcription and translation, but I'll just read the English. A place much feared and despised by some people, such that it was as if the child who was placed in the school was similar to a person falling from atop the railings of a ship into the raging whitecaps of the ocean, one where the victim could not escape because in their final understanding, there was no one to save them, and then they would soon die. Such metaphorical language here, common to storytelling in Hawaiian language, underscores the depth of bad feelings the reformatory generated after being open for only 8 years. Mahoi argues that the reformatory is back on track to serve its purpose as a refuge or pu'uhonua now due to changes in leadership and his own presence, but the rest of his report nonetheless reveals various ongoing problems at the school. He notes that there are currently 144 students held at Keoni'ula, 5 girls and the rest boys, and that the facilities are overcrowded. In the cafeteria, for example, he shares, because of the extreme tightness of this room, the students stand up at mealtimes. Given such critiques, it appears that there were repeated attempts to close and abolish the reformatory. And I'm still kind of gathering more information about those efforts, but it could maybe say more in Q&A. But just to conclude, Looking at how youth were criminalized and institutionalized under the Hawaiian Kingdom is important because it shows both how the kingdom government laid a foundation for the further development of youth incarceration under the territorial government, and how many Western gendered ideas about labor, childhood, and parenting were not yet solidified. The so-called problem of having girls in the reformatory during the kingdom era perhaps says more about how threatening so-called truant and vagrant Native Hawaiian boys were at the time to the Haole society at that time. But it also shows that perhaps the Western ideas about how Native Hawaiian girls needed to conform to certain ideals of domestic labor and chastity were not yet fully ingrained in Hawaiian society in the 1860s. By 1945, the Territorial Industrial School for Girls would describe the building up of a desirable attitude toward work as key to the rehabilitation of delinquent girls. And the manual for that school notes, most of our wards have never been taught that work is an important part of every satisfactory life, and so regard it as punishment. The school placed a heavy emphasis on getting the girls accustomed to domestic labor, along with building skills such as sewing and weaving lauhala mats, fans, and baskets. Such training and systems emphasized the necessity of the girls fitting into the capitalist heteropatriarchal society of the territory. Nonetheless, institutionalized Native Hawaiian girls and boys continued to flaunt such expectations, constantly running away from the school, having same-sex relationships among themselves, and even starting riots at their respective schools. There's just so many accounts and stories that I couldn't even fully begin to think about how to share them all, but happy to talk about that as well. So by engaging the history of youth incarceration and resistance in Hawaii, my hope is that we can begin to fully grasp how abolition of incarceration in Hawaii is key to our decolonization, and celebrate how our youth have never fully accepted being disciplined into Western gender norms. And yeah, with that, I'll kind of end my talking at you component of my presentation today. Maybe just a few cool things to share with you before we have more of a discussion. I spent some time over the summer trying to kind of pinpoint more specifically where the schools were located. So this is a map from 1887 that shows where the reformatory school was. It's interesting to see, what map makers at the time think are important institutions to mark on a map. And what I've found is on almost every map of Honolulu during the Kingdom era and beyond, the reformatory school is on the map. What else? Oh yeah, I guess another kind of interesting rabbit hole I went down while I was at the archives this summer was about the Ka'imiloa voyage, the boat that Kalakaua bought to be kind of a naval vessel for the kingdom, and it sailed to Samoa as part of a kind of diplomatic mission in 1887. And yeah, I found this photo of boys who were on the Ka'imiloa and went and voyaged to Samoa with that delegation, and they were all boys from who were at Keʻoniʻula, who were being held at Keʻoniʻula. I'm still trying to understand more about why that was, why they were put on the boat, but kind of repeatedly the Keʻoniʻula is referred to as a training vessel. And it definitely seems like the boys were kind of the biggest demographic of people on the Ka'imiloa. And it also seems through the records that I have read that they were involved in kind of refurbishing the ship before it took sail. But then kind of one of their main functions when they were actually in Samoa was performing as a band. and I think Kea Cook's book talks about how the Samoan dignitaries, made of really enjoyed their performances. Here's another map that I was happy to find, that because it kind of pinpointed where the girls' school was in Mōʻī. This is the one that is probably on your campus, or was on what is now the UH campus. So you can see it was kind of just right next to, right up against the quarry, where now there's the parking structure on lower campus. And these were some photos that I believe are of that school, because you can see Manoa Valley in the background. That Mark Patterson, who is the warden of Hawaii, of the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility, which he was able to kind of officially help rename the Kapuāiwa Youth and Family Wellness Center in 2018. My students and I went to visit with him, and he gave us a great tour around the grounds and some of the history from what he knew. And then he also just had these photo books of, photos that were mostly of the Kapuāiwa site, but also what we discovered were these photos that were of the Mōʻī site. I know there might be students in the audience who are part of Kumu Kavika Tengen's field school at Waileʻe, and happy to talk more about kind of what I've seen from the history of the documents about the history of Waileʻe. But yeah, and yeah, here's just a photo of Kapuāiwa, which, if you're not familiar, is across the street from what is now the women's prison in Kailua. Sometimes it had kind of different names and attributions of where it was over the years. So sometimes it's referred to as being in Maunawili. Sometimes it's being referred to as being in Waimanalo. My family's from Waimanalo, and it seems clear that this is in Kailua. But my family has a lot of theories about why they might have been saying the school was in Waimanalo. But anyway, I'll stop talking now, and then I'm happy to hear your all's thoughts and comments. And then, yeah.
Okay, I think we have some time for Q&A. I believe we have it set up so that you can just raise your hand there, speak clearly, and Dr. Arvin should be able to hear you and see you, although not like very close up. We are doing a shot of the audience. So please. Yes, in the back.
So you're coming to us today from, which is necessarily known as the juvenile residential capital of the world. In that it has one of, if not the most, residential treatment programs for minors in the world today. A lot of these programs, have history as indigenous, lack of a better word, holding centers. And in modern day, bastardize the Hawaiian culture and language for marketing purposes. So I'm just curious if this is something that influences the way that you talk about your research while teaching specifically students in Utah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that I'm aware of and think about. I'm not sure I have like a fully formed thing that I am doing with that yet, but yeah, it's heavy it's heavy. It's a heavy topic and a heavy history, and it's hard to, when you start to dig into it, to see that it's in a lot of places, including Hawaii and Utah. So, but yeah, I think, you know, I'm not a historian of Utah, but, you know, continuing to try to learn more about the history of those things here. And yeah, I guess I'll say more broadly, you know, I think when I started this project and started to get into the documents about these institutions in Hawaii, I think my kind of general like thesis or hypothesis or something was like, oh yeah, these were like Native American boarding schools, but in Hawaii, and nobody recognizes them as such. And then last year, the federal government recognized them as such because they published a report on federal Indian boarding schools, and they included, you know, most of the institutions that I'm researching, but also Kamehameha schools. And so yeah, I think you know, those kind of comparative histories are always kind of part of what I'm thinking about, and part of, you know, what I want to do with that is definitely more than just saying like, oh yes, these were exactly like the Native American boarding schools, or these were so different from the schools, because of course there are similarities and differences, but I think just always trying to acknowledge kind of the broader context in which, you know, what the government in Hawaii was doing was always kind of looking to both Native American boarding schools and other kind of industrial and training schools that sometimes mostly took white children, but like poor white children, right? Or in California, you know, Latino children and Black children. And I think there's not like you know, I've kind of moved from what I thought I might be doing at first, which was saying like, oh yes, these were like those, to like, I don't know, just like wanting to be more careful, and because it's complicated. Like there's definitely a relation, but it's not one-to-one. And I think one of the hard things that has come out of having Hawaiian institutions in that federal report on boarding schools is, you know, when I talk to people in Hawaii about this research, I think there's often like a quick reaction of like, oh, what happened on the continent is so terrible, and the boarding schools, you know, for Native Americans were, you know, just such violent, awful places, and it's awful that, you know, there's unmarked burial grounds being excavated now, and like, of course, I agree with all that sentiment. It is really awful, but I think then people in Hawaii are kind of quick to say like, oh, that it wasn't that bad here, and I just think I don't think we know yet. Like, it might be that it, you know, it was different for sure. And we don't have kind of a lot of kind of the stories passed down through our families necessarily about kind of abuse in boarding schools in the same way that Native Americans have. But I think especially in relation to the schools at ʻŌle, Maile, Kapuāiwa, that girls' school at Mōʻī, I think we just don't know enough. So I don't think it's like a historically informed thing to say that like the schools were not as bad here. Yeah, I'm not saying that they necessarily were, but I'm saying we don't know. And certainly in the course of looking through a lot of the archival documents, there are many reports of abuse and and sometimes deaths of children. And so, yeah, I think, again, it's heavy, and, you know, the work that I'm doing, I just am constantly trying to find ways to like do justice to it, to do it in a way that doesn't reproduce kind of traumatic narratives, but does kind of, I don't know, just bring to light what happened here and what it might mean for us today. Yeah.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and letting us know your department, that would be.
Oh yeah, ʻOle Kūwili, I'm religion and sexuality studies major in molecular cell biology and Native Hawaiian and ʻōlelo Hawaiʻi minor. So I wanted to ask you which nūpepa that you, I saw you put the Pacific Commercial Advertiser and nūpepa kuʻokoʻa, and I was wondering if you looked at any others, and if so, like what keywords were you looking for? Because I'm mostly looking at it online since I haven't been to the archives or like been to more areas with like actual papers. So what keywords would you suggest I look for, and what newspapers should I look for if I was going to like participate in this research?
Oh, mahalo, that's kind of you. And yeah, I'm happy to kind of talk more. I mean, in general, I have also been using Papakilo for the nūpepa research, and like newspapers.com or something for the English language ones. And yeah, I think for that first institution, ʻOle, yeah, a lot of the hits that come up in the English language newspapers are Pacific Commercial Advertiser, and the nūpepa, yeah, often the kuʻokoʻa, but other ones as well. So yeah, I haven't really focused on like one set of one particular newspaper, but yeah, mostly I've been using Papakilo and keywords with, you know, including the place names of these schools, kind of the Hawaiian language, you know, kind of key terms associated. So like kula, hoʻopololei, or kula, hanalima, or just kind of like, I think, you know, some of the like, yeah, like kolohe keikikane or kolohe opo, and like, you know, some of the legal terms that like would be associated with how children got sent to these institutions. But yeah.
Oh, thank you. And I also wanted to ask, was there a reason why you didn't look or focus more on Kamehameha schools as much, or is that something that you're going to continue to do?
So short answer is no, no thanks. I mean,
I understand.
and I think, you know, I started this research before that report came out, and I think a lot of the feelings that people in Hawaii had were in reaction to Kamehameha being named in the report. You know, including my mom's an alum, you know, she was like, yeah, it was a boarding school. But, you know, I don't know, I'm not as invested in the history of Kamehameha. I think a lot of other folks are already doing that scholarship, and they have a lot of resources to do history themselves. But these other institutions that were public, that were more punitive, those are the ones that I feel it's my kind of kuleana to look into, and that's where my interest lies.
Mahalo.
Mahalo.
Hi, Nancy Marker. I'm in the Social Science Research Institute, and I've worked for many years in what we have the Center for Youth Research. And it was formed really to work on research and evaluation on juvenile delinquency and corrections. And over the years, we have a lot of reports, if anyone's interested, that we published since the 60s up through the 90s or so, that cover a lot of topics. And I also went through the period of time, there was a lot of efforts to reform the Hawaii Youth Correctional Facility, and they did all kinds of trainings. They sent people for trainings, they brought people in. Utah was a place that they looked to for models of you know, programming and facilities that were thought of as more ideal, those kinds of things. So anyway, I just wanted to say that there is a lot of material about from the period of the 1960s up to the 90s, so when people, and it was before Mark came on and with HYCF and has now changed it and all that, but there was a lot of work to try to make changes and improvements in the system, but it just kept being some of the same things being done over and over. A lot of efforts, a lot of money went in, a lot of people were involved, and we do have some documentation on that if anybody's interested in what went on. There's also studies of people looking at behavior, youth behavior and youth at risk. And we studied gangs and delinquency for quite a few years. So, but there were people who were really working to try to reform the youth correctional system in those years. Just wanted to share that.
Yeah, mahalo.
So, aloha, my name is noʻeau. I'm American Studies, and I'm just curious as to whether you found any evidence of inclusion between the plantation owners and the judiciary system, in the sense that you're talking about free labor. We're talking, you know what I mean, that this is a captive audience of labor, and you're not having to pay for them, and yeah, did you find evidence?
I mean, yes, yes. So in the Hawaii State Archives, you know, they have, I don't think there's like a comprehensive, like every certificate of indenture that they ever issued, but there's a stack of them. And there's also the correspondence that the Board of Education, which was in charge of the reformatory, received and sent. And so, yeah, and in the correspondence, you see kind of, you know, I don't know, to me, like random Haole people, sometimes Hawaiian people, but kind of the majority of them were like sugar plantation owners, or, you know, whoever is managing, yeah, probably not the owners, but like whoever is managing the day-to-day operations of the plantations. And yeah, they're just writing the board and asking like, you know, I'm interested in having like so-and-so come and, you know, be apprenticed to work with me on the plantation. And so, and yeah, it appears that the Board of Education was pretty, you know, I don't see any records of them saying no to anyone. So it seems like almost anyone who, you know, wrote in and asked for a boy to indenture, the board was pretty favorable to that. It, you know, it technically it's, you know, in the records, it says that like the boys had to agree in order to be like officially indentured out to the plantations, or sometimes there were other like trades, like I think there's like blacksmithing or like shoemaking, some things like that. And so like in the law and in kind of the board records, it says that the boys, you know, it's always noted that the boys agreed to be indentured, but of course, it's hard to tell what that meant in practice, and you know how much they actually gave consent, and if it's even possible to give consent when you're an indentured child. So yeah.
We have time for one last question.
I'm Maile, Kadika, Penga, Ethnic Studies, Anthropology. Thanks for the shout out for my field school and students, some of them who are here. Could you share a little bit about what you see as a story of Waiale'e, and also why you chose the specific image of the lo'i that the Ferrans have helped to replant? I know one of the stories that Kawela often tells is that among the other things, the boys did at Waialae was to plant kalo. So for you, what's the story there? And then also your selection of this image.
Yeah, mahalo Kavika, and mahalo to your students for all the work that you all are doing. Yeah, I think, you know, like I was kind of saying before, I just think as they get into the research, it's more and more complicated to tell one story about this history. You know, at Waialae, it was really interesting when I went there with my students over the summer, as well as with Kumu Derek Tyra, if he's also in the house, he's also doing research on Waialae and some of these other institutions. And you know, so we visited first with Kavela, and you know, looked at the Lōʻī and the Kalu pond. Kavela shared, you know, some of the stories about the pond, and I think we all felt just the work that Kavela and others are doing there is so healing and just kind of I don't know, spiritually and like materially very important, and in part, you know, because of the importance of the restoration of land and kalo to the lahui everywhere, but I think also because of the very particular history of that land and the ways that the history of the school is still very, very present on the land, you know, through many of the structures are still standing. So, and so, for example, when we visited with Kavela, we met in that kind of like a open air pavilion, which maybe was formerly part of the agricultural part of the school, which probably you and your students have also met with Kavela at. And he showed us there's graffiti on in that structure that is likely from the boys. The boys' school closed at Waialae in 1950. So, you know, it's sometime before the 1950s, and you all might have seen those markings as well. And, you know, one of the ones that stood out to us was a number. I think there's like a number and then it says boy next to it. And, you know, yeah, I think it's just very visceral to kind of see things like that and know in a different way that, you know, that these children were here and they had numbers. And, you know, kind of the next day, I think one of my students found records at the State Archives of, you know, kind of a roster of the boys at Waialae and with their numbers. And so, yeah, and then we also went across the street and visited with Mahia Miller and got to see a little bit of the Pearl Haven site that they've restored. And there's still you know, a lot of the buildings on their side they've restored, but there's still kind of the most, I think the building that most people have seen before it was kind of fenced off. That's like a big structure that remains in ruins. And, you know, talking with some of the staff at Pearl Haven, you know, they said like, oh yeah, the girls say that, the girls that stay at Pearl Haven, they say that there's dungeons in that building and it's haunted. And, you know, my students and I like were looking at each other and trying to decide like how much to say or not say. And, you know, we started to say, well, actually, like, I don't know if you'd call it dungeons, but, you know, there were solitary cells in that building that, you know, that children were placed in when they were understood to be too problematic or whatever. And I think the girls say that today because you can still see the building and look into it and see that there are cells down there. And so we started to say a little bit of that, and the staff person was like, "Oh no, don't tell me. I don't want to know," which is fair as someone who has to work there every day. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think kind of the historical record is just one part of this history, and then but like it can never be fully told only with the records that are at the Hawaii State Archives. So I think the oral histories that you and your students are doing are really important. I mean, I know you're not focused on just the school necessarily, but I think oral histories are so vital to properly doing justice to the stories of these children as well as just really kind of still the physical like sites they tell a story still, and I think this research, I've just come more and more to see that it really needs to be engaged with community, and especially the people who have real connections to the sites of these places, because the sites are still very much here. Again, like the history is still very, very present. And so that's why, also over the summer, I kind of started to form an advisory board for kind of a website version of this research that could make more of these histories more accessible to people. But yeah, so very, very luckily, Kavela and Mahea agreed to be on that board, as well as in relation to Kapuāiwa, Mark Patterson and Kimi Takata, who works for the Pu'a Foundation, and then from Avis Poʻai, who has also helped me kind of decipher a lot of the Hawaiian Kingdom ʻōlelo, and also has a great experience with the Puna by ʻOle database, and then also Lorinda Riley, who's also done work and research at Kapuāiwa, and Derek Tyra, who's going to be, we're kind of partnering to build a website about this history. And I don't know. I hope that answered your question in part.
Fortunately, that's all we have time for. Before we wrap up, just a couple announcements. If you are in the seminar class that follows this, we'll be right up here. Quickly want to shout out to Soyan and Jian, our GAs who helped with this event. Team is technically and faculty and wigs. If you have any questions about our upcoming next colloquium on October 6th with Dr. Brandy McDougall, please feel free to contact me. We hope to see you there. And finally, of course, please join me in thanking our guest, Dr. Maile Arvin.
Yeah, mahalo. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for coming out. We'll see you again in October.